seconds, we'll get this show on the road. Okay, we've just joined. Let's move forward. And thank you again for providing any kind of prompts to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will talk about public lands and national parks and the challenges that they're facing amid the country's continued emergence from the pandemic. Our special guests are Theresa, Pierno, President and CEO of the National Parks Conservation Association, Christine Lehnertz, President and CEO of the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, and Laura Herrin, CEO and President of ACE, the American Conservation Experience. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show. We'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all for joining us. It's great to see you. And just to set you up, if you take a look back at Teddy Roosevelt's essential creation of the modern national park systems, our natural lands have been viewed as an American treasure. So today we're seeing an ecological disaster in terms of fires, droughts, and other climatic and human impacts unfolding before our eyes. So let's talk about why Americans of all stripes, including business interests, energy companies, ranchers, and others, should be really concerned about conserving our national parks and other lands. So let's start with you, Theresa. How do you see the way Americans' attitudes are evolving right now, given what we're all experiencing?
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me on the program. You know, I think that COVID made everybody realize how important the outdoors and parks and open spaces are. And so we saw a huge surge over the last year and a half in really people getting out into their national parks. And I think as they've gotten out, they care about them even more than ever. And we're seeing that. And we're also seeing, of course, the increase in fires, drought, severe weather. Temperatures in Death Valley, continue to hit records and break records as it continues to rise. And so, the impacts that we know are from climate change are really impacting our national parks severely, with so many of our national parks being coastal marine parks. So impacts from sea level rise and the increased storms and hurricanes. And then, of course, our Western parks that are really being hit hard by fires. But we're also seeing issues of development impact. We saw huge surges with oil and gas leasing and oil and gas development. And so many of our national parks, they're not islands. They depend very much on the entire land around the parks in order to really be healthy. And wildlife doesn't know park boundaries. So the impacts that are happening to wildlife in our national parks, wildlife corridors, all of those things are having a really significant impact on people's visitor experience. So it's important that we look for solutions and ways that we can continue to reduce our fossil fuels and continue to do things in a very important environmental way to protect these critical places for all of us.
Well, educated by leaders like yourselves, I've been saying for years that our natural resources are limited, but it's really struck home with the fires. Christine, if you take a look at all the fires that we've been suffering here throughout the West, it is really clear when you drive down roads that we have a limited resources and whole swaths of those resources are being burned up. How are you taking a cut at getting people involved in the solution and on the preservation of these lands at the Golden Gate National Conservancy?
Mark, here at the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, the idea that we connect people to parks is really the greatest power that I think that we all have. We have almost 330 million people who can really steward the parks, who can really think about the choices that they make every day that will help us get through this era. I think that we care about parks because they're a bellwether. They tell us when you're a large natural landscape, they help us to understand what it means to see climate change impacts on the ground, to see what a snowmageddon means a rain event on snow, those things that are so substantially different than our natural areas have seen over the more than 100 years of the national park system, and more than almost 150 years. Yellowstone's going to be 150 years old next year. So when we think about in the area where we are in the Bay Area, we have access to hundreds of thousands of people who connect with national parks. As Theresa said, this COVID era has connected people with these spaces on a really personal level. So I think that human connection is a big part of the solution when we can get people serving on lands, visiting lands, inspired by lands, and really understanding what the future holds for us if we don't make those connections really meaningful.
And you're setting up Laura, right? I mean, this whole idea of, we planned this all, before. It was a nefarious discussion. Laura, your organization gets people involved, right? It's particularly young people. Talk about how you take this idea and transform it into an experience.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for pulling this wonderful group together. I'm honored to be a part of it. I think about it this way. The Conservation Corps movement began because Liz Putnam, who founded the Student Conservation Association, talked about the parks being loved to death. And that was the beginning of all of this, and understanding the power of young people to make change. And that's what we did. We combined getting young people out, actually doing some of this backlog maintenance, doing the visitor services and education, because what we have seen with COVID is exactly what both Theresa and Christine talked about, is the impact, the unintended consequences of many more people out on the land and on the trails. We've seen trails, for example, that are like 3 and 4 times as wide as they should be. So the damage of more people and not understanding. We experienced fire directly. We lost a camp in Big Basin State Park in California last year where we had things. So we continue to really think about that next generation. And that next generation is different every time. And it's a generation of digital natives. So thinking about the parks in that hands-on experience that we provide, and then technology, and how do we bridge that? So we have all the, we want the parks to be there for everybody, but we also want informed and wise usage of these resources, because they are finite, and when they're gone, they're gone. So that's sort of where we come at this, of trying to provide those opportunities for young people so they become that next generation of stewards and leaders, and are sitting in these chairs in the next iteration of this and other great opportunities.
And as we become more urban, I think we have different questions, and our experiences need to be somewhat different. I have a real question about this idea of connecting people to parks. If we are increasingly living urban, interconnected lives, which are informed by technology and not necessarily nature, how do we actually change how we function in order to connect people? Because our constituents are far more diverse. They're ethnically diverse, they're religiously diverse, they're experientially diverse, right? The idea of inclusion means that you have to meet people where they are, yet so often the attitudes in the environmental movement are informed by people who have an experience that is not quite the same as the people we're trying to engage. Theresa, you're very familiar with this idea. How are you changing your staff, your board, your programs in order to help people become engaged?
So I think it really starts with making sure that the programs and what your priorities are really focused on the needs of the broader community. And so, for so long, the national parks didn't tell the stories that really represent all Americans. So we have focused now for, the last couple decades, and particularly more than the last decade, to really focus on what are those stories that we're not hearing about women, about people of color. We worked really hard for Pullman to come on board, the first LGBTQ site in Stonewall, as well as Birmingham and Harriet Tubman and Cesar Chavez, and all these stories that are so important for people to see themselves in our national parks and hear the history told. So that is critical, as well as working to engage younger, diverse audiences. We created something called the Next Generation Advisory Council about 7 years ago. And what that has brought to our organization and being able to really commit and work on projects and continuing to bring in diverse fellows, as well as our staff now is about 38% people of color. And we continue to build a board that is very diverse, because you have to address it at every level. So in staffing and then people in parks, we need to work with the national park system so that there is diversity within the national park system, which has really struggled to really change that culture. And that is critical if we're going to be successful in really connecting people to urban parks. There's parks in every state, and there's parks in cities across this country. And we just need to be welcoming, and we need to really make sure that they're seeing their own stories and themselves in these places.
So we just completed a poll, which, and the conclusion of the poll was that 90% of the people responding said natural lands are essential to American identity, and the other 10% said very important. So if we're talking about essential, this idea of inclusion and being able to tell the story from different perspectives is so important. And Christine, you have an additional challenge in that your organization is working with people from urban areas in close proximity to vast natural lands, and then the Golden Gate National Park is very diverse itself. When you're talking to people who either are visitors to this area from different parts of the world, when you're talking about kids who basically are inner city kids, how do your programs help to shift their perceptions and also meet them where they are? In other words, informed by their current sensibility so that they can be brought into yours.
Mark, that's such a great intersectionality question, right? And like Laura, we have had the opportunity for nearly a generation to work with youth in the Bay Area. 750,000 young people have come through what's known as our Christie Field Center, which is about youth education, youth leadership, and this connection to nature. And they have shown us, they have taught us through the years that this intersection of past, present, and future is where they see themselves. So when they walk into a park, and we know that history is written every day in a park, but who holds the pen? It's giving up the pen. I was really lucky to work with the National Park Service for over a dozen years in Yellowstone and Grand Canyon, in parks all across the West. And I can tell you that a wonderful organization in the National Park Service has still created parks in our own image, like we are on the screen today, as opposed to thinking about the co-creation of these lands in terms of honoring who was here before. When we think of the Ramaytush Ohlone, when we think of the coastal Miwok here on the western part of San Francisco in the Bay, we have young people coming to us saying, we want to learn about that story from the past and understand what it means in today's terms: social justice, environmental justice, colonialism, this divide in economics that we see so severely in the San Francisco and Bay Area. Parks are free here. You can come into 84,000 acres onto the Presidio for free. And how we make this an opportunity of choice for people, truly we're learning from the generations that are rising now into the leadership of environment and national parks.
That's really interesting, the idea of giving up the pen, right? Giving up the ability to tell the story. So when you think about giving up the pen, how does that function? How does that mean that your programs, the content of your programs, are you giving up the pen in terms of writing the scripts for those programs, Laura? When you're thinking about what kind of experiences young people are going to have, are the young people themselves able to define those experiences in terms of what's important to them?
Yes, and I hadn't heard that term, but it resonates, giving up the pen. I think the experiences evolve as our world changes. We again, as a partner of the Park Service, have been doing some work to also expand and be more welcoming, doing our own internal work, but also working on some pretty important partnerships with the Park Service that help young people from different backgrounds understand what it's like to work for the service, because it's what we found is it hasn't changed over the years. The demographics haven't changed. So we've been working on some very deliberate programs that bring a cohort of young people together from different backgrounds and bring Park Service employees from different backgrounds. So
are you trying to recruit people who are going through your program? Are you trying to give them an idea that this could be their profession as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have various ways to help them do that, to be that pipeline. But it's also giving them a realistic picture that the Park Service is not just a park ranger out in the back end. It can be a plumber, electrician, admin. There's such a vast opportunities. So we're using some of these program models to help build that pipeline for young people and give them the chance that they might not have ever thought of. That's the other thing, is ensuring that we all understand that conservation can be right in your backyard. It doesn't have to be somewhere else. And I think that's a really important, whether it's a national park, your local park, but it's right where you are. And we're trying to really think about how the different ways to embrace that as well.
I want to ask you three a question. I had a really interesting experience. We were doing some work for one of the largest conservation organizations in the world. We were recruiting a executive there. And the thing that struck me is that when we were talking about inclusivity, I got a lot of lectures from leadership, which basically comes from a scientific conservation tradition about how wrong everybody else was to think about conservation in terms that did not align to the traditions of that particular organization, which was really interesting. Mm-hmm. Because each of our organizations has its own traditions, has its own thinking. Audubon has its thread. Sierra Club has its thread. TNC has its thread, right? And you all have your threads. How do you change a culture when, of course, the people who are there currently come out of a particular tradition? How do you evolve that? Do you create change agents within your organization? Or are you trying to get people together to think in different terms? Christine, do you bring people in who have different perspectives to help leaven that picture? How do you do it?
Mark, I think you're right on that. There's this collective effort we need to make. What we know is when you come to the table, you bring unique skills and a mission, but you also bring things that you share in common with others in the world. Think about traditional ecological knowledge. That's something that's coming to the forefront in conservation and preservation from tribes around the world, really, to say there are stories that we've handed down verbally through generations about this ecology, this landscape. And so I think, though there is a tendency sometimes to think my nonprofit or my mission or my vision is the right one for this time, we actually see when we bring people together in collaborative, we have a wonderful California Landscape Stewardship Network that's bringing people together for the first time across California to say, this is a big complex issue with wildland fire. It is a big complex issue with climate change. We can no longer do that alone. And we can also no longer do it as only the government sector or only a social sector or only the private sector. It is a combination of communities that have to be at the heart of that, as well as the tools that each of those sectors bring to magnify, to amplify. If we have an opportunity ahead, this next generation needs to inherit something different than what we've done in the past. And the go it alone, we just know isn't working anymore.
So you're creating a culture of listening to different viewpoints and different ways of approaching the same problem. We just completed a poll in which we said, what is the biggest benefits of having open public land in national state parks? And non-commercial human use garnered 53%, and the rest were to promote biodiversity. But when you take a look at the national parks, for example, Theresa, there are a lot of different interests. There are recreational interests, so there are touristic interests. There are some mining interests. There are logging interests. You have a lot of different uses. So taking Christine's point about bringing different perspectives in and having that dialogue to create a transfer of knowledge, do you also bring in different interests, perhaps interests that are not traditionally associated with conservation, but frankly, if trees burn down, right, across the West, it's going to affect the business interests, whether it's tourist, ecotourism or logging interests. It's going to adversely affect a lot of different people. Do you bring people together to talk about these kinds of issues?
Absolutely. And we actually brought together, in fact, a large coalition, and were ultimately successful with many others in getting the Great American Outdoors Act passed that actually supported funding and really helped to boost some of the needs of parks. But, even through...
Could you just explain that, because this is a really, it was voted on by both, it was supported by members of both parties.
Huge
right?
Bipartisan support. But, years in the making, decades really in the making to get that bill passed. But really, again, showing and bringing everybody to the table that the impacts that were happening and the fact that the neglect that was happening in our public lands, our national parks, and the lack of funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund was really having an enormous impact. And they finally, agreed, yes, it was, and $6.5 billion over 5 years. The fully funding, the $900 million a year of the Land and Water Conservation Fund as well, to really help get some of the maintenance issues under control. But of course, there's still huge needs at parks. But I think, your point is, and I think what at the end of it, I loved the, giving up the pen. At the end of the day, we have to do that. And we have to change who's sitting around the table, because otherwise as an organization, it's impossible to really change if you don't really make sure that you have and are inclusive, as well as looking at your own policies, looking really internally at your own history. And when we celebrated our own centennial, 100 years, just a couple years ago, we looked really and spoke about some of that history, that we weren't always on the right side of history. Many times we didn't look at the impacts, whether it was to the Native American community or, when we supported a certain project. And so, you kind of have to really speak about that and own that. And then you have to say, okay, what are you doing differently moving forward, and make a commitment to really true inclusivity, which means, everybody has to be at the table. We have to have these conversations, and we have to listen.
And
Well,
I could build on that a little bit. And it's a lot of work. It's not a checkbox. I think that's where we're at. We've been really looking at our internal culture and how we can change. And we've brought on a senior level staff person, for example, from the Park Service to help us do this work. But as we talk about internally, it's work, and it might never be done. As we look at, as you said, Theresa, our policies, our procedures, just our language, how we talk about things. There's just so much to do. And right now, what we're really looking at is how do we start to move that needle, and not expecting that it's going to change overnight, but putting in the effort, rolling up our sleeves, and not just being, quite honestly, a hashtag. That's been important for us to think about, is diving in and really focusing internally first, so that then we can be better looking outwards.
In a sense, don't you have to shape a staff that is ready to, as they do their work, transition their teams on a continual basis, so that we remain aligned to the current environment in which we operate, right? So in a sense, we're creating teams that are not focused on their own comfort and their own confirming their own opinions, but constantly collecting information on other people's opinions, other people's perspectives, and how do you shape those different perspectives into a program that advances conservation, right? Is that what you're basically talking about in terms of it being work, Laura? Yeah. That you're constantly being informed by new data?
New data and getting out of our own way. That my vision of conservation may be different than Teresa's, maybe different than yours or Christine's, and that doesn't make that invalid. Hunting and fishing, great example. very big conservationists. That may not be how I think of it, but it's really broadening how we look at these and embracing that, and not just saying, well, this is conservation. Conservation can be ugly sometimes. It's not necessarily all the glamorous things. It could be having
It could be
greatest
killing pussycats and rats and invasive species, right?
and blind squirrels. Exactly. Feral hogs. So there's lots of pieces of conservation that may not fit our vision, but we have to embrace that largely. And that hopefully will bring in more people, being more welcoming, being more inclusive, and not saying, well, you're a hunter, so we don't want you as a part of our vision of conservation. So those are some of the things we think about.
As we look at our lands, our natural lands, our air, our water, I have a feeling over the last, particularly decades, we have a nibbling away issue at natural lands, that around the borders at first, and sometimes it's not even nibbling away, sometimes it's tens of thousands of acres if you take a look at the Amazon. We are constantly trying to push back on a diminishing resource. Christine, is there a way to flip that script in which we can add to parks and add to our conserved spaces as part of this solution?
I think we have to. When we think about, the 30/30 initiative in the Biden administration, when we think of ways to take the lands that are set aside, not just in national parks, although those are meant to be in perpetuity, we have to think the partnerships with agricultural lands. We need to think of the partnerships all around parks. When you think of, the Yukon to Yellowstone, when you think of wildlife corridors, when you think of air sheds and what it means to protect the air that is emitted from one location today, but travels to another part of the nation or another part of the globe. And so it is a complex issue we face, significantly more complex when you look at our loss of biodiversity. But I have to tell you, I am really enthused by this generation. When you look at the young people coming through our program, it almost feels to me like talking to young people in the parks, and we're getting them back in the parks in person again, is that they see a longer future than we've ever seen in my generation, in the generation that comes just after me. And so they are, I believe, thinking about how to work both the brake and the accelerator. So the brakes to slow the changing world that we see that's impeding on the natural experience, and the accelerator on what these experiences mean for people, what they mean in terms of their spirit. We know there's hundreds of stories that talk about the benefits of these open places, these natural areas, to health, to our mental health, to our physical health. And so I think this idea that it can't just be the gas pedal or just be the brake, and that we have people who are seeing that combination differently, it gives me a lot of hope for the future.
Well, from your lips to God's ear, we just completed a third poll in which we asked how often do people attending visit the national parks, and we had 39% say monthly and 48% said annually. Now, this is a select audience, but I think people are very much connected to these parks. Theresa, we're going to let you see us out. What do you think the future holds in terms of being able to create recovery in lands that have been damaged and add to the parks? I think back at the Adirondacks, which were a devastated region by timber harvesting for construction and coal, and really did come back through the long-term stewardship of citizens all across New York State and all across the nation. How do you see the future evolving in the national parks?
I completely agree with Christine. I think that the reality is our planet is resilient. And the fact is that with what we see in the efforts being undertaken, we can recover and we can protect our parks and our public lands so that they'll be here for generations. But it is going to take doing things differently. And it's certainly our youth gives me hope as well that we're going to get there, but it's going to take a lot of work, and our 30 by 30 support and all of us, getting on board and living and really showing that we're willing to do things differently by making changes in our own lives. And parks are a great place for people to come and to learn about some of these new things that they can do, as well as the importance of really protecting these treasured spaces. So let's hope that we'll all continue and continue to work and make sure that we really treasure our national parks.
I want to make a point. It can be sometimes small acts, right? I write with this. I fill ink into a pen and I reuse the pen. I don't throw it away. I started to do it just as something to think about, not throwing away things, right? And you see about plastics polluting our ocean and so on. So I just started doing it in that way. It was just a small thing to make me think a little bit, to make me be a little bit more deliberate. And I learned that from somebody else who basically said the same thing to me. So I think that it really is the small act. It's being involved in an organization like yours, Laura, like yours, Christine, like yours, Theresa. It's talking with people like we're doing today. It's advocating a little bit and just changing a little bit every day. And maybe at the end of the day, we end up with more natural lands and lands in a better state. Thank you all for joining us. Theresa Pierno, President and CEO of the National Parks Conservation Association, Christine Lehnertz, President and CEO of the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, and Laura Herrin, President and CEO of ACE, the American Conservation Experience. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Attendees, thank you very much for coming together and for participating in this. Everybody have a great day. Stay safe.